This is the original version of the episode in English. It is also available in a French dub version. Bienvenue dans Invisibility. Today, I'm joined by an English therapist, Jerry Hyde. For those who follow the podcast, he's the husband of the artist and filmmaker Mai Hua, whom I interviewed in episode 7. Together, they created the film May Day, which has just been released. The documentary follows a 14-day therapeutic retreat, similar to the ones they regularly hold. For this one, Mai and Jerry brought together 12 participants in a remote forest with no electricity or phone signal. I watched it last week and it was fascinating, unsettling, moving, but also full of love. It captures an intense collective and intimate experience where each person confronts their story, their shadows, fears and traumas, and it also shows the importance of the circle and of mutual listening. Mai and Jerry were there to present the movie, and I immediately thought Jerry has to be on the podcast. Jerry mainly works normally with men, and one of his specialty is men's sharing circles. You can get a glimpse of that in his movie Make Me a Man. They did it with Mai too. The movie brings together testimonies from men who have taken part in such groups. That too is a powerful emotional experience, and it's very rare. I wanted to learn more about him and his journey, which, as you'll hear, is very unique and very psychedelic. In this episode, we talk, among other things, about addiction, power, violence, rituals, humility, and vulnerability. Hello, Jerry.
Bonjour.
I'm so happy you're here. That will be my first episode in English. So, yeah, I hope it works. And so, yes, here we are. You called yourself a rock and roll therapist. And also I read the most dangerous therapist in the world. So can you explain what it is and present yourself what kind of therapy we're talking about?
Yeah, they say the internet never forgets. So I think this label of the most dangerous therapist in the world will haunt me forever. But it's something that someone described to me. And part of it I took because I thought it was funny. But part of it I think is really true. It's not true. I mean, who is the, it's not a quantifiable thing. But when I thought about it, I thought actually therapy should be dangerous to who you think you are. That Eckhart Tolle said the biggest obstacle to change is our attachment to our persona. So I think when you enter into therapy, a lot of the blocks, a lot of the resistance that mostly are unconscious. I mean, we don't pay to go and resist someone, but there's always resistance in the therapeutic journey. And I think that's the part of us that feels threatened by exploring new versions of ourselves and new truths about ourselves. So that for me is the danger of it. It endangers our false self. So I like that play on words, especially in an industry that is, we think about safety. And I hear people talk a lot about, I didn't feel safe in this situation. You didn't make me safe. You didn't create a safe space. I was talking with Mai earlier about the film that we've made, and we didn't create a safe space. We created a dangerous space where people could, or perhaps not a dangerous space, but a disruptive space, where people would be challenged. There's no point in making a safe space for me. You don't want to be threatened. You don't want to be in an unhealthy place that's going to harm you. But also, what's the point of going to therapy or going to a retreat? If you want to go to a wellness retreat or a spa, fine. But if you want to grow, I think we don't grow in the comfort zone. So we have to create spaces that endanger our sense of comfort. But it's a play on words. Mm-hmm. The rock and roll thing is, that's my history. I learned how to run groups by being in a rock and roll band. That's where you learn about egos and group dynamics. So that was my youth. And I've always been involved in theatre, and I like, again, it's the disruptive side of it, and that kind of punk attitude rather than a traditional formal. There's a lot of expectations around therapy, and I think that they all have their place, different forms of therapy, but I appeal to a certain crowd, and so I'm just exploiting that. Really, it's a way of, we all need to stand out, and show what is our interest. And so I use these terms because I think it attracts a certain kind of person that I'm probably, I always say I'm probably the greatest therapist in the world for about 50 people. The other 8 billion, I'm the worst. So it's just how to make those connections, because I think therapy is really about chemistry. So if I can present myself in a certain way so that I can appeal to someone who wants to talk to someone who's more left field, then I'm saving everyone a lot of time, because it's difficult. Therapy, it's like any relationship. It's hard to find the right person who you can open up to.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so we're going to talk about it, but first I want to go a little back. So it's about the invisible here, and I guess, like in your case, you got interested in invisible dynamics that shape us, that shape individuals, humans, maybe society, and or maybe things we don't want to see, maybe not invisible, but some. So I was wondering, and maybe it's a bad definition, you will tell me, but I'm wondering, when did you begin to get interested in this? And maybe does it come from childhood already, or did it come later? And how did it appear, this interest in your life?
I think invisible, I hadn't looked at it that way. I think it's quite a good definition of the kind of people I attract. Perhaps I would always describe my client base as outsiders, so that you could also argue, well, those are the invisible people in society. They're not mainstream, and that's a reflection of myself. I come from a very conventional, quite conservative. Some, my parents, very conservative, conventional people, and I had a lot of learning disabilities when I was a child, and I didn't fit into the conventional academic system. And so, as soon as I could get out of school, I left mainstream culture and kind of disappeared into the underground in London in the 1980s. There was a big kind of squat scene in the 80s where we lived in derelict housing, abandoned housing, and we were very much outside of society, which I loved because it really represented freedom, and I didn't really want to be part of visible society, in a conventional sense. And I don't know.
How did the shift happen? Because from your parents and then quitting school, like how did this shift happen?
I just ran away. It's very traditional. Yeah, but I was sent to boarding school as well. So I kind of left school I left home when I was little, So this is, one of those weird English things where we get other people to raise our children for us. I don't. I think it's a horrible system, but as part of, the whole British imperialist model.
Okay, so then you left in the underground scene, and when I said about the invisible forces that shape us, like when did you begin to see it, like in people, in yourself, maybe, like?
Probably when I dropped acid the first time.
I love it.
Yeah, I had a really strong, I don't know where it came from. That's interesting. I had a very, very, very strong, actually I do know where, if you've got time for a story.
We're here for that, so yes, please.
So maybe when I was 6 or 7, there was a big rock and roll festival near where I lived, and I had an older cousin who was maybe 15 who went to this rock and roll festival, obviously got completely fucked up on drugs, ran out of money, rang my parents, said, I don't have the money for the train home, can you sort me out? So I remember going and picking her up and being really impressed because she was wearing a bright yellow suit, like huge flared trousers and this bright yellow jacket and bright yellow massive floppy hat. Mm-hmm. And she had a boyfriend with her who was, I guess, the same age, 15, 16, who looked like Jesus, and he had no shoes. And I just thought, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life. And my parents openly hated them. They were so disgusted, and they took them home to our house and gave them some food and then put them on the train. And I remember being, again, really impressed because I was terrified of my father. He was a very, oppressive, strict man. And when he went to take these two to the station, the guy who looked like Jesus, the boyfriend, my dad came in and went, come on, you guys, let's get you on the train, get you out of here or whatever. And this guy stood up. He wasn't in the slightest bit scared. And as he walked across the room without any shoes on, he just winked at me. And my dad took them to the station. Then he came back and he gave me a lecture. He kind of sat me, and you see that young man, he's a dropout, and he's everything that's wrong with society. And I thought, wow, that's what I want to be when I grow up. He became my hero because he had no shoes. He was totally free and he wasn't frightened. And there was something about him. I don't know if that soda, I think it did sow a seed in me of wanting to be part of subculture, even though I was too little to understand what it was. And then I started reading, subculture stuff when I was at school. I can't explain why I was into Jack Kerouac instead of William Shakespeare or, Ken Kesey or Tom Wolfe, these kind of underground writers. But I started reading this kind of stuff, and I just had it wasn't about escapism. It was a deep desire to explore this psychedelic realm. It was a real passion. It was a real calling, you could say it's a calling. And so I started to, all of my friends, we all started to take a lot of LSD and a lot of mushrooms and mostly things like that. I mean, we were doing speed and marijuana. And this was, I was walking here just now and I could smell cannabis on the street, which is less usual in Paris. Where I live in London just smells of weed, and I've been coming to Paris since I've been with Mai for 10 years now. And when I first came, I was like, wow, this city doesn't smell of weed, it doesn't smell like home. And now it's beginning to change here as attitudes, I guess, change or relax. But in the early 80s, it was proper Wild West. It was so subculture. And I think I loved being part of subculture. It was drugs for me represented being part of a tribe. And I did them for about 10 years and I quit when I was 28. And I remember it wasn't difficult to stop drugs for me. It was very difficult to detach from that tribe. That sense of being part of a subculture was really, really hard. The actual withdrawal from taking narcotics was not too challenging, but...
You talked about being in a rock band and being in the subculture and discovering what ego is. So, and then you stop being with that crowd. How did it happen and why? And where did you go at that time afterwards?
Because I think I got into it in the beginning in an exploratory, inquisitive way. And after 10 years, I realized I had just become... it was escapism. It was no longer exploration. It was masking things. And again, it was an instinct. One day I woke up and I didn't take anything ever again. Literally, one morning I woke up and I thought, let me see if I can get till this evening without, my daily drug of choice was cannabis, so I'd smoke dope all day. And I just didn't do it that day. And then I started to realize I can do this. And I think it became about the challenge I had very heightened experiences on narcotics, and that was great. And then I thought, but I resented a bit. I don't want to be dependent on anything to have an experience. I want to be able to have this naturally, and then I have the choice. So then that became, was it 28? I didn't do anything again till I was 50. And then when I was 50, I started to explore plant medicine, things like ayahuasca and iboga and peyote, bufo, various different psychedelics that were beginning to emerge in what's now being called the psychedelic renaissance. Mm-hmm. And I haven't done lots and lots and lots, but it was good to return to that as an older person. I remember the first ayahuasca retreat I ever went to. There was a lot of very young people the age that I was when I started to take psychedelics, and there was a talking circle after the first night, and these younger people going, wow, that was the most amazing experience of my life. I have no idea what it meant, but it was incredible. And I thought, well, I understood everything I was shown and I wouldn't have done, and I didn't when I was 20 or 18 or whatever. I knew I was getting a glimpse of something, but I didn't have the life experience or the wisdom or whatever it takes to process it. And when I was 50, I was able to process it. And I remember the Dalai Lama being asked about psychedelics, and someone said, is this a kind of instant enlightenment? And he went, yes, it absolutely is, but unless you've done 15, 20 years work on yourself, or meditation or whatever, you won't be able to process it. So there is no shortcut. So I realized I had to, get a glimpse, then go and do some work on myself, because I'd done 20 odd years of therapy, and then it was nice. It was again, everything feels very instinctive to me. I'd known about ayahuasca for 15 years, and it was a thought in my head one day I might do that, and then one day I was meditating, and it was like, right, now, do it now. And I made the call. I was there that weekend, and that gave me a lot to work with.
So you have this kind of intuition, like you're connected to inside of yourself. So, but you were saying you did like years of therapy. How did you enter the first time in therapy, and why? Like, did you have any resistance? Did you choose to go there? How, like, I know like it's an intimate question, but yeah, I'm curious.
I mean, I'm an addict, and if you could cure me, I would say no. Because everything I do, whether it's making a film, writing a book, doing therapy, taking drugs, I don't have an addictive relationship to narcotics now. I went, after I first took ayahuasca, I didn't take it again for 6 years. I really felt I'd been shown so much. I needed a lot of time to digest that. But in myself, I'm very addictive, and I think addiction, obviously, as we all know, has a very dark side, but there's also something very positive for me in it, and it makes me very driven and very committed. People think of drug addicts as these kind of wasters, but actually you have to be quite organized and you can to be a functioning addict. And I think with therapy, I just was like, oh wow, this is the new drug. This whole new place to explore and investigate. And of course, I didn't just do therapy. I became a therapist. So I did 10 years of training, and then I got into Tantra, and then I got into shamanism, and then I got back into psychedelics. So I have a huge appetite for that thing that took me to acid in the first place, which was, like I say, I didn't do LSD to just get wasted. I did it because I'd read Huxley, and I wanted to explore the doors of perception. And interestingly, I remember one of my first ever trips, I saw a door, and it just went, not yet. You're not ready to go through this door. And it wasn't until I was 50 that I was ready.
Amazing, like being shown this door and not going through it, yeah? So you got specialized as a therapist with violent offenders. Was it the beginning, and why, and how was that? Like,
I did that because the opportunity arose. Someone, said that I was training with, actually said there's an opening at this domestic violence project. I mean, just to say about the intuition thing, because I have a lot of learning difficulties. I'm not academic, I'm not intellectual, and what I've come to suspect is perhaps it's a little bit like you hear that blind people have very good hearing, or deaf people have very good sense of smell or whatever. I wonder if I'm compensated, or I've developed my intuition more so because I'm not very good academically. So I think I intuitively, even though I was a bit scared, and I was very green, I'd only been training for a year, but they had their own training, so they trained me to do those groups. I was very scared, but intuitively I thought, well, when else am I, I've got to start somewhere. And then it was a good choice, because people used to say to me, wow, you've really jumped in the deep end here. And actually it's not true in many ways, because you don't have to be a very good therapist to work in domestic violence, because the problem is obvious. He is hitting her. End of story. How to work with that is a little bit more complex, although it's quite formulaic. And I was taught the formula, which was fairly straightforward and kind of psychoeducational. But compared with the work I do now, it was very, very simple. I think the more sophisticated you get in this thing we call therapy, the harder it gets. And a lot of the work I do now is talking to people about what didn't happen rather than what did happen. That's really difficult. And it's a kind of ugly, crass thing to say, but if you've been raped or abused, the work is easy for me. I don't mean it's an easy thing to have experienced, but it's really obvious what the problem is. But if you've been neglected in an invisible way, which most of us have to some degree through no one's fault, it's much harder to work out what has affected us and what shaped us. So I think it was good work for me to do in the beginning, and it was scary and it was threatening, and it made me quite. It takes quite a lot to scare me now.
I guess so. But also what I hear, it was a group therapy, and you're specialized in group therapy now. So it was the beginning of a long path, and then you got specialized afterwards in anger management. Is that right? And maybe sexuality. So how has it been, and why did you take that path also afterwards?
I mean, I've been incredibly lucky in the opportunities that have arisen. So because I've done the domestic violence work, which is, it's pretty extreme. I got more group work experience than my peers, and I started young. I was 28 when I started training, so I was probably 30 when I started the domestic violence work. But because I had that experience, then some similarly tough sexuality group work came up that I was offered, and I was trained to do that. And at the same time, anger management was a big thing. And there's always some, let's not forget therapy is a business. So there's always something that's the kind of buzzword or whatever. And in those days, it was anger management. Because I had worked in prisons and with violent offenders, I was an obvious choice to help people do that. And, it was good work. I remember the guy at the center where I trained at the center, and then I became a trainer at the center. I remember him saying, if you do anger management and the sexuality work and with the violence work, you will get so much shit from people. They will attack you so much. You'll be nothing will frighten you anymore once you've been through that. And it was true. It was really hardcore for a few years. But I knew that possibly because, this gets complex as well. I'm trying to simplify it. I think the appeal for me, like a lot of therapists don't do group work. They seem to be frightened of it, or maybe they weren't fortunate and didn't have the opportunities I had to train to do it. It's certainly less common than one-to-one. But I think for me, or where it comes from, everything comes from a wound. And in my family of origin, I think I was trying to hold the family together. So that was my original training. And then it was a kind of easy transition to make. So the groups that I have now, I mean, one of my groups is 25 years old, another one's 22 years old. I'm kind of creating families. I'm not doing group therapy in a conventional sense. They're therapeutic, but they're part of the infrastructure of people's life, and they come back for years and years and years. So that's what turns me on.
These are men groups mostly. I mean, you also have mixed groups, and there is this documentary made by Mai, Make Me a Man. And the phrase you use is, wearing a mask is the first lesson in the process of socialization, which is bell hooks phrase. So what is this mask? And also I want to ask, you've been leading all these men groups. How are men doing today?
Oh, God, that's a huge question. I mean, the guys I work with are doing great. I don't know about the rest of them. I mean, just to say about men's groups, I think, this is contentious, because then we get into gender. I'm not really interested in gender, which I remember when I met Mai, she was really surprised. She thought we'd sit around talking about masculinity. I mean, we never talk about these things. We're just trying to be better people. But I think one of the reasons that I do men's groups is men are less inclined to seek out groups. And when we do, they're very, there's strict rules, which is talk about football. That's it. Really. Sport. And even when I run a group, I'll run a 3-hour group, we'll have a tea break in the middle, they'll talk about deep, emotional, painful things, they'll go have a cup of tea and talk about football, and then come back. So I think we're breaking a kind of thing that is put on us, by society, these social, these implicit back to invisible rules that most of us don't even realize we're obeying. So I think women have different rules, and part of that is they commune. They tend to commune more. They're more likely to have girlfriends that they talk intimately with about their problems that men don't. I think we're beginning to, but it's slow. We're far behind. So to create kind of almost prefabricated constructs, groups is necessary for men. I did run a women's group for a while because they came to me and they said, "We're jealous. We'd like to be in one of your groups, and will you facilitate one for us?" Which I did, and I thought it was great. But it didn't. It lasted maybe 3 or 4 months, and I learned a huge amount from that. I would say maybe 30-40% of the men I work with have been sexually abused, whereas all of these women had been sexually abused, which I think is a reflection of society. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't like they happened to have all, And the difference was really extreme. So the men that I work with who have been abused have been seduced. And most of them, the work is to make them understand, and this is also part of my own history, to make them understand they've been abused, because they've been seduced by someone who was kind of a special friend and blah, 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 whereas the women were violently raped or assaulted. So that was really difficult for them to work with, because they would come to a group, one of them would talk about a rape or an assault. It would traumatize all of them. They would go away and they would be in pieces for days, and then they'd come back 2 weeks later and the same thing. So after about 3 months, they were like, "We just can't do this." Which I think it was appropriate for them to stop. They needed a much slower, subtler approach, I think. Whereas the men, I'm trying to bash down the door, So I've gone off on a tangent. I can't even remember your question now. How are men doing? Yeah, I don't know about men. I'm very concerned by a lot of things I see in the media. This kind of manosphere stuff, and Andrew Tate. For a while I was getting a bit depressed because in my own tiny little way I thought, well, we're making progress, and then I see stuff that's kind of more my father's generation of values, and and it wasn't actually the men. The men like Andrew Tate, I can go, idiot, I can dismiss it. But my daughter sent me a screenshot. I have 2 daughters. And one of my daughters sent me a screenshot of some young women responding to men like that, saying, yes, we want this. We want to be old school kind of wives, and we love what you're doing. That freaked me out. I was like, oh, shit, I thought it was just men that were the problem. But then trad wives, that's what they call them, isn't it? So I think it's not just men that, are kind of harking back to this old patriarchal misogynistic way, and that feels a bit depressing, given having dedicated 30 years of my life to trying to make, but these things take generations to swing backwards and forwards.
But I guess it must be very satisfying to see men transform themselves in your groups. And as in the movie, like, it's really moving, like, to see, and you see how difficult it is for them to talk about themselves and to get intimate. And it's really like, I cried and I watched it with my partner, and we were like so moved, and it's so rare to see these kind of spaces. So I guess for you, it must be also satisfying to witness this movement.
Yeah, it's hugely satisfying. I mean, that's a large part of why I like to work long term with people. It's a very selfish impulse on my part. No, not necessarily negatively selfish, but I've, like with the retreats that you saw in the latest film, I've stopped doing public retreats, and now I just do invitation only, because I realized that I could do a retreat in Nepal or in the UK or wherever and get 25 people and then never see them again. And that's not what turns me on. I want to be part of the journey. So these longer term groups, I was just away for a long weekend with about 15 people from the different groups that I run. And I mean, I hardly have to open my mouth because they're so good. They're so expert in their own way. And I didn't walk in with any plan at all for 3 days or 4 days or whatever it was. We just walked in, sat down and talked for 3.5 days and got into really, really deep stuff. And that's the turn on for me, is you can work with me individually and, hopefully we can do some good work. But if you join a group in a long-term way, there are people in there that have worked for 25 years. They got as much experience as me in their own way. And they will see things that I miss. Every therapist is going to have blind spots. But in a group, the buzz is when someone picks up on something I've missed. And I go, oh shit, I should have seen that. But someone's seen it. So it's a very powerful space to evolve, because you can't really bullshit.
Coming back to masks, you said we have a culture where lying has become normalized. So to debunk this must be so difficult. How do you do that? Do you have some steps you go through?
You maybe made that note from something I said in the Q&A the other night. I think I said that. Mai asked me a few months ago. She said, was I driven by care for people? Was it caring for people that was the real driving force in my career? And I was like, not at all. I have to care for them, but it's not the driver. The driver is, I want to be in relationships where the implicit contract is we're going to tell the truth. That's a very, very healing, safe, real environment for me. I don't like talking in a kind of chit-chat way where all of people, this is, I don't want to knock it, but it's just not for me. I can't make polite social conversation. I'm just rubbish at it. But, and even when I was training, I remember they said to me, Jerry, you're amazing in the groups. You can go really deep, but you're really bad in the tea breaks. You need to learn how to just, have social chat. And that's still something I haven't nailed particularly. But that's what I love about being in the role that I'm in, is everyone I talk to is just like, well, let's tell the truth, And that's coming from a family of bullshit and, English manners and rules and etiquette. Which was, for me, such a lie. And so much of that kind of middle class and upper class society, I thought it was such a lie in England, with this stiff upper lip bullshit. So I'm really driven by a desire to be for me, it's just safety. If we're going to tell the truth, I know what I'm dealing with. If we're going to bullshit each other, then I'm frightened. So, and I think mainstream culture has gone the other way, in that it's no longer... Like when, in Trump's first administration, there was a lot of shock. Oh my God, can you believe he said this? You don't see that as much anymore, because I think it's become normalized, and we have come to accept that Starmer, Macron, Trump, whoever, they will just lie. And it's like, oh, but it's just Trump. That's the kind of response. Oh, it's just Trump. Oh, but no, it's lying. You're lying as part of your political strategy, and that freaks me out, that's become, maybe it's always been the case and they're just not very good at it anymore, but I think since the turn of the century, for the last 25 years, that's what I've seen. When I was younger, maybe I was naive, but I thought that it seemed to me that there was a degree of truth that was being spoken that's gone. I don't know. Maybe I was just fooled and it's always been a load of bullshit, but...
I mean, at least you as a therapist and as a human being, you're going the other way. And in the movie, Mai and you show your vulnerability, and my partner, afterward, he told me it felt so restorative and so soothing to see a man say he did something wrong, and to say it and accept it and recognize it. It made me really feel better. And so there is a lot of story of abuse, child abuse, women's abuse, but you never see a man saying, I'm sorry, I did this, and I'm sorry. There is not a single man saying, I abused whatever, whoever, and saying, I'm sorry, I fucked up. What the fuck? Why is it so difficult to admit? And how was your own path toward this, truth?
I mean, that's a very big question. And it's a really good question. I've thought for a long time, I would vote for someone who said, I think I got that wrong. Can you imagine?
Yeah, me too. I mean, we never hear that. That's crazy, right?
You know, I mean, you have a guy in France who, you know, if he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I think I made a mistake there," you might get a few more years. So I think it's deeply cultural, isn't it? And I guess it's wrapped in this whole kind of masculinist thing of just always being right. I think it's one of the things that's really put onto men. We should always be right, you know, and it's a very deep part of the system, never to admit failure, never to admit that you're wrong. And to me, that's terrifying. If I put myself in that position, then I've got to fight, I've got to be combative, and it's I mean, I'm dyslexic, and I think I discovered when I was running a lot of these sexuality groups that were very psychoeducational, and there was a lot of biology involved as along with the other things. And so people would ask me stuff because I was in a teacher role suddenly, and I realized that when I was asked about a particular part of anatomy or something, which I'm just shit at that stuff, I would kind of freeze and go blank and almost have a panic attack and think, oh my God, I can't even remember my own name right now. And I realized that the way out of that was to say, I haven't got a clue. Who does anyone else know? And then it was like, oh wow, that just the humility of saying, I don't know. And then I think saying, actually, I got that wrong. You can't be attacked. So I think everything's about safety for me. It's just like transparency. I say this a lot. Transparency is a superpower. And I had a very, very neurotic therapist for a while. He was more neurotic than me. And I remember saying to him at one point, I want to write a book. And he was like, you can't write a book. I was like, oh shit, why not? And he said, because of all the bad things you've done, all the drugs you've taken, and you know, you cheated on your first wife and you had an affair and blah blah blah. You can't, you know, if you write a book, then you'll be on things like Amazon and people will put in the readers' kind of, you know, comments, oh, he's the person who did all that shit, and you'll be destroyed. And I was like, oh Christ, I hadn't thought about that. So I didn't write a book. And then a few years went by and I still wanted to write a book. And I had this moment where I thought, well, if I just say everything bad I've ever done and put it in the book, if they say on Amazon, he's that therapist who did that stuff, I can say, yes, in the fucking book. So you can't touch me. Mm-hmm. You know, so I think it's crazy to me, this culture of hiding stuff, because if you hide stuff, you're on the run forever. You know, I have a very unfiltered, transparent approach because I can't be caught out. There's no secrets, you know, and I believe in privacy, and there's certain things that I will not share, either because I think it's not something I want to share because I want to keep it private, or I don't think it's beneficial. You know, when you're in therapeutic role, I think you have to be very thoughtful about how it's going to impact people, and sometimes I'm probably not as thoughtful as I should be, but I'd rather make a mistake and overshare than be hiding. Plus, you know, the place where I trained, I said I was very fortunate with these opportunities. They were also full of shit. It taught me so much because they really had a culture of we are the best therapists in the world and we are evolved people, we're, you know, enlightened people. And the more I got to know them and the more I got into the kind of inner sanctum, I was like, you guys are all batshit crazy. This is a complete con. And that really inspired me to become, you know, another part. I don't really write this, but, you know, as much as the most dangerous therapist, I'm the most fucked up therapist because I don't want to be on a pedestal. I don't want people projecting onto me that I've got it all sorted out. We're just in this journey together. And if you come and work with me, you want to hope that I am as fucked up as you, because then I'm going to have empathy. You know, if you come to me, like, I'm not great on eating disorders because I've never had one. It's not my, you know, I'm a bit vulnerable with that, although of course I work with that. If you want to work with me on, you know, learning difficulties or, you know, drug history or things like that, I'm really good because I've been through it. You know, ideally I'm a bit further down the line than you, but
yeah, but that leads me to the question I wanted to ask you, because the question of power. As a therapist, you can have a lot of power. And also, I read you said, like, therapists are the new priests. Yeah. And it can be really dangerous. And we see it, like, in a retreat, in that context, people are so vulnerable that there is so many stories, you know, about that. Like, and so, yeah, how to balance, like, leadership, which is really important, because we see it in the movie, there is a leadership. but there is a soft leadership. I mean, strong and soft one. I don't know how to describe. I mean, that's what I feel, at least. How do you balance leadership and power yourself? I mean, you almost answered the question, but that's a big question I feel in the therapist world.
I mean, first of all, you have to deal with any dominance issues in yourself. I mean, what are you assuming this position of power for? To recognize that you have power, and that was it's always a tricky thing, but with making the film, and putting people through really, really deep, transformative, challenging work, it's like, well, are we playing God here? And I think to ask those questions, so humility in leadership is essential. I have a friend who was in Afghanistan, and I listened to him on a podcast, and they were talking about leadership, and he was talking about how in the Middle Ages the king would lead the troops into battle. Now the leaders are in a portakabin somewhere in America directing drones in the Middle East. I mean, leaders are not leading from the front anymore. So I think that's a good kind of model, that if you are going to put yourself in a position of leadership, I would never take anyone anywhere that I haven't been and that I'm not willing to go to. But I think power and leadership doesn't mean being bigger or better. So, this thing of being transparent and dismantling, I don't want to be on a pedestal. That's terrifying for me as well. If I'm on a pedestal, there's only one way to go, and that's down. Mm-hmm. So I'm always trying to level the relationship. And then, what is a leader? Well, very important in certain situations, but a plumber is very important when you have a burst pipe. It doesn't mean that they're better than you or that you're better than them. It's just this is the person who has that particular skill set. And I like to work collectively, but it's no different to being on a boat. You just have someone who's doing the sails and someone who's cooking the food and someone who's steering the ship. Maybe I'm the person steering the ship sometimes, but even that, not always. I'll hand it over to someone else. So I think knowing our roles, and a friend of mine said to me years ago, he said, you have so many people on your team. Why do you do that? You could make so much money if you had fewer people, because I normally have a crew of about 10 people that I've worked with for a long time. And I said, well, yeah, I could make a lot of money, but this is where I like to spend my money, is on these people. It makes everyone safer because the power is distributed. Mm. And there was a group, my 25-year-old group, about 10 years ago, as an experiment. I said, I want to join it. I want us to become a collective rather than... And they were, okay. And I was in the group for about 6 months, and I mean, that caused all sorts of chaos and mayhem. And after a while, I said, I don't think this is working. And they were like, yeah, no, we really need a leader. Because I went in and I thought, oh, okay, I need to be a role model now of how to fall to pieces. So I had a complete nervous breakdown. And they were like, no, dad is falling to
That's too much.
But, it's... so I went back into the role of facilitator. But they know a lot about me. And I think it's, humility. That would be the key ingredient.
You talk a lot about helping people go visit their shadows, their dark sides. And can we talk about that, about going to see? Because I know how transformative it is. So I want to share about that a bit, like about shadows and going to see and not being afraid about that, like, at the contrary.
There's a lot of themes in this conversation, aren't there? Talking about these leaders who lie to us. I think they lie. My theory is they lie because they can't face their own shadow. And so you become increasingly two-dimensional. At some point, you have to stop trying to be right. Trump's always bigging himself up and talking about how amazing he is. And I guess they've all got their version of that. But you can only go so far if you're interested in it evolving on a personal level. Like once, when I started, when I was 28, I really needed someone to tell me I was good, and that I had some good qualities because I'd, grown up feeling like I was just terrible. And that was really important to boost my confidence and make me feel better. And that to me would be the obvious start to any therapeutic journey. But then you have to go beyond that. Otherwise, we saw this. I don't know if you had the same language in France, but in England and America, they talked about new man, and suddenly men had to be nice all the time, nice guys. And I think that's really dangerous, because then you're just performing, really. You're not really digging into, everyone has selfishness, greed, mean thoughts, judgments, the potential for violence. I mean, we are designed for violence, to kill, to provide food, or in battle, or to defend. So that's part of us. There's no point in saying I'm a nice guy. What about that part of you that suddenly explodes when you're in traffic? How do you explain that? Oh, that's not really me. No, it is. It wasn't anyone else. And this is something I really had to confront when I was working in domestic violence. People would say, yeah, I'm not a violent person. It's just, she pushes my buttons, or it only happens when I'm drunk. Well, if that was the case, then everyone would get violent when they drink. It's not violence juice, right? It's your violence that comes out when you're disinhibited, or it's your violence that comes out when you're in traffic and you feel threatened or territorial. I'm not talking about people being bad people. I'm talking, that's the quote, the Carl Jung quote we use at the beginning of the film, which is, do you want to be good or whole? That's the choice. You want to be a good person? You want to be a good boy, good girl? Okay, good luck. You're going to have to spend a lot of energy hiding from parts of yourself. Or do you want to be a whole person? And a whole person is a bit of a shit sometimes. And then if you have humility, you can say sorry. And if you have enough self-worth, this is a kind of Buddhist thing. The Buddha said, observe yourself lovingly. Love yourself and watch. Just watch. I think if you have enough self-love, you can go, wow, what was Jerry up to just then? That was a really shitty response, rather than, oh my God, I'm such a terrible person. I'm just going to ignore that and pretend that I'm nice. To be curious is probably the most important thing I've ever learned. That's really interesting. I just exploded in that situation. What was happening that created that response in me, and what do I need to do to know it better so it doesn't happen again?
And that's a lifelong work, right?
Yeah, you don't ever arrive.
During the Q&A of the movie, you said something like, we don't have rituals in this society to get into adulthood, from childhood to adult. So we are adults faking, or children faking to be adults. And I really agree. I've been really asking myself about the lack of rituals. Are you creating your own rituals in a way, like in your work?
I wish I could say I was, in a structured way. Yeah, I mean, most of the stuff in our retreats are kind of death, rebirth rituals that get people to focus on, what do I need to let go of to go forwards in my life? But I'm still playing catch up. I mean, I think I started to feel adult in my 50s, and up until then, I was really confused, because I was like, why hasn't it happened yet? I thought it would happen. And I don't think adulthood is something that, unless you're really lucky, that just happens. I think it's, we used to have these processes of initiation, and somewhere down the line, I'm not an anthropologist, so I haven't really studied it to understand it fully, but somewhere down the line we lost these. And I just expected it to happen when I was 18, and it didn't. And I thought, well, maybe it'll happen when I'm 21, and then it didn't. And it just never seemed to happen. Then I was like, okay, shit, I've just got to get on with life and try and pay the mortgage and get a job. But inside I feel tiny and scared, and I'm just faking it. And then I realized, well, I'm not alone. What is the main criticism we make of Trump? He behaves like a fucking child. No, he doesn't behave like a child. He is a child. He's a man with extreme developmental issues. That's the truth of the situation. And that's not unusual. He's a particular character, but he's only a representation of a society, which is a very immature society. And I think there's a lot of immaturity in our world because we're not helping people to mature. And so I'm working, I don't work with kids. It's not my specialized area, but I'm working with people. It's never too late to grow up. right? So I'm working with people to take them through ordeals and challenges where they meet themselves and they go, oh, wow, I'm capable. Or I did something I was too, you see this in the movie. There's a particular person who's terrified of the dark, who by the end is able to, to go through that. So something within them has matured through facing it head on. And I think you look at the history of initiation rituals, it's always meeting a challenge. There's some really extreme ones that I think, there's no way you could do that involve body mutilation and, chopping fingers off and shit like that. But one of the most moving ones actually I ever heard of was, it was a native, I can't remember which tribe, it was a Native American. It was the different rituals for boys and girls. When the boy hit puberty, he would be taken to the forest and blindfolded and left to sit on a tree stump overnight in the dark on his own in the forest. And you could hear the animals and creatures and what have you creeping around, and he wasn't allowed to move. And in the morning they'd come and remove the it always moves me. They'd remove the blindfold and his father's sitting on the next tree. That's all you need to do. And the boy has done it and he's proved he can do it. And then he takes it off and he sees his father was there all along.
Yeah, amazing. So about rituals, like how has been your journey, after being 50 years old with plant medicine, and what have you learned about this kind of rituals and accepting you have a broader intelligence guiding you through
it was something I came back to came to in a ceremonial way. When I was in my early 20s, it was chaos, really. We were just, taking whatever we could get our hands on and doing it in a very unstructured way, which, had a lot of value. I think it really, it kind of politicized me. It really made me look at the structure of the world and who was running the world, and perhaps radicalized me a bit in that sense. But that was more of an outward view. When I was 50, it was a much more internal journey. It was, you hear these statements like ayahuasca is 10 years of therapy in one night, which in some ways it is, but like the Dalai Lama said, you still have to process it. So it's not, you don't go 10 years in one night. But I realized when I was 50, I'd done 20-something years of therapy, and that had been very helpful, but there's limits to everything. There's limits to plant medicine, there's limits to talking therapy, and there were blocks that I couldn't get past in conventional therapy, and I felt perhaps evolved enough or brave enough or desperate enough to break some of those blocks down, which plant medicine did, because let's face it, you talk to a therapist, we can all, whether it's conscious or not, if something's too painful, the shutters come up and it's very hard to penetrate beyond that. And most of the time you don't even know that's happening. If you take a plant medicine, the chances are you're not going to be able to avoid yourself in the same way. And I found it very powerful to dig deep into my unconscious, and I don't know if I could have ever got there, with conventional talking therapy. And it took me to very, last year I went to Peru. I did 11-day dieta in the jungle, and on the last night we drank the medicine, and I think it was when I was getting up at the end of the night, it was oh, and by the way, and it hit me with this thing that in my whole life I'd never really worked it out, and it was so subtle. I think, in therapy we look for the drama. It's hard to work with a very, very subtle level. So even though plant medicine sounds like it's this big dramatic thing, actually I think it's helped me to work on a very, very subtle level. And it said to me, oh, by the way, your trauma is very difficult to identify because you were loved by your parents and cared for by your parents. It's just they didn't want you. And I was like, oh, wow, that's true, because I know they loved me and I know they took care of me and they were very concerned about me. But I wasn't who they wanted. They wanted someone else. And I felt really sorry for them in a really healthy way. I felt such compassion. I was like, wow, you wanted this little boy who was going to be playing sports, playing rugby for England and being a lawyer or a doctor or something, and you got me. So I felt compassion for them, So it's like, wow, what a drag. And I felt compassion for me because I never became who I was supposed to be. But they had a really strong projection onto me. And like I guess every parent has to a certain degree. This is who I would like my child to be. And it's just, they were very rigid about it. And so whenever I didn't conform, which was like always, they would medicate me or they would send me to psychiatrists to try and make me into the boy they wanted me to be. And I just never could be because I wanted to be like Jesus with no shoes, you know. So that kind of thing, I don't know if I could have ever got there in talking therapy because it was too subtle in its own way. It was a very delicate way of looking at things and massive. I mean, it was worth flying to Peru, doing 11 nights of mayhem just to get that little last kind of, oh, and by the way.
In a very loving way. Yeah, also. So last question I want to ask you, how do you stay connected to the invisible in your day-to-day, in your practice, in maybe in things, books you read, whatever comes to you like that you could share to keep this relationship open?
I think what you said, practice is, it's a practice, you know, to evolve, to work on yourself, or, you know, for some people, they go to church. That's a practice. For some people, they meditate. It's a practice. I had some, because I prepare and guide people through plant medicine experiences a lot, and I had one person years ago who came to me and said, I've had this amazing connection with this plant spirit and I'm frightened I'm going to lose touch with her. Do you think I will? And I said, well, yeah, if you don't call me, if you don't text, you don't visit, we'll lose touch. You have to put that into your practice. And for me, when I first drank ayahuasca, it felt like I invited a benign demon to possess me. You know, we talk about demonic possession like it's a terrible thing. For me, it was a benign demon or a benign spirit. Or, you know, no different to when I was a kid and I believed in Jesus. You know, it's like he lived in me and I would talk to him when my mum made me pray every night, so I would give prayers to Jesus or whatever. Now I do that to Mother Ayahuasca and I really feel a connection with that spirit. And it doesn't matter to me whether that's real or not, or if it's just a fantasy in my head. It's a way of dialoguing with, you know, in 12-step culture, they call it your higher self, or they call it God or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's a way of staying alive to the invisible, to the mystery, you know, of that which we can't see. And I think we're essentially hunter-gatherers, you know, trying to live in urban societies, but we're still, you know, we're not descended from hunter-gatherers. In terms of our DNA, it takes about 25,000 years for any evolutionary shift to happen on a DNA level. So you and I are not descended from cave people. We are cave people in our sensibilities. Just we live in different environments. But I think we're highly tuned beings, you know, and one of the things I loved the most when I was training, they said something like 85% of communication is nonverbal. So we're all scanning and reading each other's body language all the time. We're all picking up on invisible signals from each other. How much you're alive to that depends on how much time you put into it. If all you do is drink beer and watch TV, you probably won't be too sensitive to it. But if you want to be sensitive to it, you know, what is intuition? It's listening to a deeper part of yourself beyond your intellect. That's all. It's not that intellect is wrong, but we're a very intellect-focused. Again, when I was in Peru, someone had given me some medicine cards, and I pulled one of these cards, and it was beautiful. It kind of changed my life in one card in terms of my attitude towards some of my life experiences. It said you can get a lot of knowledge about ayahuasca by reading about it, by doing research. You can do a thesis, you can dig into the internet, you can get loads and loads of knowledge. But if you want wisdom, you got to fucking drink it. And I thought, oh, that's really true, because education in you know, my education was very knowledge based. It was feeding us data and teaching us to be knowledgeable. And for me, where I learned the most was with my grandfather, you know, in his workshop, watching him make things, or in his, you know, he was a farmer, so being on the land, watching him grow things. That was far more fascinating to me than being in a classroom where I was being taught knowledge. So I think balance your life between, knowledge is fantastic, but balance your life by giving yourself experiences that deepen your wisdom as well. We need wise people. And I think we have a lot of very knowledgeable people and a lot of access to knowledge in a way that we never have done before. But we don't give as much importance to the wise people that we used to in the old days. There was always some crazy old person living in a cave that you would go and talk to,
And also maybe sitting around a fire in a circle.
Yeah, well, the circle is the shaman, right? That is it. You sit people down around a fire and they remember that experience. It's very, very quick. It's pure instinct, I think.
Thank you very much, Jerry, for taking the time to be there, to share your wisdom, because you have this wisdom and it's really restorative to listen to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. It's a pleasure. I really appreciate the notes, that you've taken the time to research it and make it a really rich conversation.
Merci.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean that. That's unusual.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget you can leave a comment on your favorite platform, give it 5 stars and share it. That's how this fully self-produced podcast can grow and reach more people. You'll find all the links and contact info in the episode description. You can also message me on Instagram at invisibly_podcast or email me at invisiblypodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for joining me on this journey.